This is the arid heart of the western Canadian interior, deep within the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, where sun-baked Badlands meet vast alkali flats. The old ranching outfits called these alkaline basins the Dead Country. The region records barely 100 millimeters of rainfall in an average year, while dry winds and scorching prairie summers pull more than 3,000 millimeters back into the atmosphere through evaporation. Roughly 30 times more moisture leaves this terrain than falls from the sky. Blinding dust storms regularly shut down secondary highways. Absolutely nothing about this landscape suggests commercial maritime fisheries. Then, on a bright morning, technicians standing at an automated control console engaged intake manifolds and released 100,000 saltwater marine fish directly into this parched ground. Pacific black rockfish, spotted wolffish, and tide pool sculpins. 12 months later, 99% of that initial stock was still alive and thriving. The story of how that happened is what we are investigating today. In the dusty expanse where rolling prairie coulees taper into glaring white crusts of mineral salts, an ambitious team broke ground on massive containment basins. These were neither laboratory tanks nor brief pilot installations meant to impress regional development officers. They were full-scale commercial production ponds, excavated into the dry earth, with barren sandstone ridges lining the horizon and the Pacific coastline sitting over 2,000 kilometers away across multiple mountain ranges. Into those earthen reservoirs went 100,000 juvenile marine fry that, by every biological rule, had no business existing in an arid continental basin. Under standard operational expectations, the entire population should have died within weeks. Instead, practically all of them survived. A survival rate of 99% is an extraordinary outlier in commercial aquaculture. Open-water maritime operations off Vancouver Island or the Atlantic seaboard regularly suffer far greater losses during a standard production cycle. Yet the biological success was not the most surprising element. The financial numbers were even more unexpected. Within a few production cycles, the annual take-home earnings for a technician working these dryland aquaculture installations reached roughly 32,000 Canadian dollars. That figure placed them more than $11,000 ahead of conventional dryland farmers and grain growers tending neighboring tracts. In one of the driest, most mineral-heavy expanses on the continent, harvesting marine seafood was yielding better margins than harvesting wheat. But you have to ask the obvious question: where does the water come from? This arid corner of the interior is far less vacant than it appears from the highway. The entire territory is immense, spanning hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, with only a modest fraction genuinely hospitable for classic settlement. Yet tucked away beneath the benchlands are glacial meltwater streams, irrigation reservoirs, and endorheic saline basins. Tally up every accessible basin and lake, and the region holds more than 5,000 square kilometers of surface water. That is more water surface area than Prince Edward Island, positioned in a district farther from the open ocean than almost anywhere else in the country. These remote water bodies already supported over 500 varieties of indigenous microcrustaceans and algae, forming a functional food web waiting for an apex feeder. But there was a fundamental hurdle, which is why traditional agriculture had ignored the resource for over a century. The water was completely unpotable. It was far too mineralized for livestock, toxic to conventional row crops, and trapped within dense, saline alkaline soil profiles that degrade surface runoff. It was a compounding disadvantage, non-arable ground trapping unusable water, and that is where this ceases to be a story about Badlands and becomes a story about advanced water chemistry. The breakthrough traces back to a specialized facility situated on Crown land leasehold ground, where researchers chose a radically counterintuitive path. Rather than undertaking the ruinous expense and sluggish pace of broad-scale desalination, the uninspired default approach, the applied science group posed a very different question. What if the fundamental challenge was never the gross volume of mineral salts dissolved in the basin, but rather the exact ratio of the ionic species? True seawater possesses an exceptionally precise chemical equilibrium, and those microscopic ratios dictate cellular osmotic balance for anything that breathes through gills. Drawing on collaborative research funding and technical partnerships spanning coastal oceanographic institutes in British Columbia and the Maritimes, the technical team ran endless chemical assays to isolate what inland waters lacked. The baseline basin chemistry was missing specific concentrations of calcium, magnesium, and potassium ions, minerals that are inexpensive, widely accessible across Canadian industrial supply chains, and completely non-toxic to living organisms. By dosing raw lake water with precisely calibrated mineral supplements and routing the intake through a custom-built continuous circulation treatment manifold, the fluid emerging at the discharge end was chemically indistinguishable from natural ocean water to the physiology of a marine fish. They never wasted capital trying to strip the mineral salts away. They simply completed the molecular recipe. That straightforward conceptual reframe became the foundation on which the entire inland aquaculture sector was erected, generating a robust portfolio of domestic patents. The raw baseline salinity in several interior basins was already remarkably close to maritime ocean levels. The engineers simply had to discover what was absent and balance the ledger. Next came the unglamorous operational factor that rarely makes glossy promotional brochures: continental weather. Working with Environment and Climate Change Canada, the regional administration deployed a dedicated micrometeorological sensor grid across the production territory. This network generated specialized 48-hour advance operational forecasts tailored for aquaculture technicians, providing critical early warnings for sudden prairie dust storms, severe heat waves, polar vortex cold snaps, and damaging gale-force winds. That vital window gave facility crews sufficient lead time to seal thermal pond covers, cycle auxiliary circulation loops, and recalibrate monitoring sensors before atmospheric disruptions struck. On the physical infrastructure side, design engineers built an automated thermal management and biofiltration loop, engineered to maintain pond water steadily between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, completely insulated from volatile swings of the open prairie atmosphere. Yet here is the crucial detail standard reporting routinely overlooks. Climatologists and weather specialists were not integrated after the stock was introduced. They were embedded on day one. They pinpointed the exact atmospheric transportation window to haul delicate juvenile fingerlings across long-distance transit corridors from coastal hatcheries. Transporting live juvenile marine organisms over thousands of kilometers of highway and rail is the single most precarious phase of the operational chain. Make a miscalculation on the seasonal weather window, and an entire generation of stock can be lost before reaching the receiving manifold. That rigorous predictive weather modeling was the quiet driving force behind the 99% survival metric. The default assumption among outside observers is to view this arid landscape as a punishing obstacle conquered through sheer stubbornness. But that viewpoint misses reality entirely. In commercial terms, the remote desert-like interior acts as an invaluable operational asset. Consider biosecurity and aquatic disease, which represent an ongoing nightmare for coastal net pen aquaculture. Open-water maritime farms on coastal channels are continuously exposed to migrating wild schools, adjacent maritime traffic, terrestrial municipal runoff, and neighboring operations. Pathogens and sea lice circulate freely through natural tides, which is why conventional operations rely so heavily on prophylactic antibiotic regimens. An enclosed inland facility, situated on an isolated semi-arid flat, has no wild marine populations within 1,000 kilometers, and zero hydrological connection to an ocean bay. The very isolation that renders the terrain seemingly desolate turns each production pond into a sterile clean room. That geographic quarantine carries immense commercial significance. Stringent international seafood import standards across the European Union, Japan, and the United States continuously test for residual antibiotic traces, and a single non-compliant test can shut down an export channel for a season. A facility that avoids broad-spectrum pharmaceuticals passes CFIA inspections and foreign port screening without friction, maintaining preferred supply contracts year-round. When premium international buyers pay a substantial surcharge for inland Canadian marine product, that price difference is largely a certification premium, reflecting pure, verifiable biosecurity. Then, examine the extreme diurnal temperature swings. Interior basins bake under intense summer sunshine throughout the afternoon, only for temperatures to plunge sharply the moment the sun dips behind western ridges. On a standard agricultural spreadsheet, this volatility is listed as a major environmental hazard. For an enclosed, sensor-monitored aquaculture system, it functions almost like a biological throttle. Cold prairie nights naturally depress unwanted bacterial growth and suppress algal blooms in staging reservoirs, while the immense daily thermal range gives operators precise physical tools to manipulate water stratification without burning surplus energy. Pair that wide thermal band with the highest annual sunshine hours in Canada, and you produce optimal photosynthetic and biological growth conditions that coastal operations require massive utility inputs to match. Furthermore, source water fills basins free of municipal storm overflow, industrial chemical effluent, or coastal maritime pollutants. Domestic consumers in major metropolitan centers from Vancouver to Toronto have spent recent years paying intense scrutiny to the ecological health of waterways supplying their tables. An inland seafood product that can verifiably demonstrate it never contacted contaminated coastal tides occupies an unassailable branding position that conventional ocean producers cannot replicate. The arid interior functions less as an obstacle and far more as an environmental filter. That brings us directly to why this sector took off: pure economics. Through targeted federal and provincial rural diversification mandates, private capital and regional development grants were directed toward commercial aquaculture across Western Canada's interior basins, with the objective of transforming neglected, mineral-heavy flatlands into a high-output protein corridor. The velocity of this transition outpaced even optimistic municipal projections. Total annual yields across regional facilities climbed past 180,000 metric tons of premium aquatic products, representing a gross market valuation exceeding 700 million Canadian dollars. Direct-to-consumer domestic distribution and refrigerated logistics channels expanded by double digits annually. Dedicated parcels of mineralized land holding viable saline water now encompass tens of thousands of hectares across the territory. Regional economic development corporations project the broader industry cluster could approach $4 billion over the coming decade. That capital injection filters straight down to regional communities and rural family balance sheets. Industrial finfish operations alone have generated over 3,000 direct technical and operational jobs across the prairie interior. In localized production clusters, consistent aquaculture operations have injected tens of thousands of dollars in supplementary income into dozens of rural households. In farming townships where multi-generational grain growers had never handled commercial seafood in their lives, high-value marine protein has become the central economic driver of the local municipality. Yet behind all of this sits a fundamental physical bottleneck promotional marketing seldom mentions. The real operational constraint was never access to raw water. The true limiting factor is feed formulation and long-distance freight logistics. Fish cannot synthesize dense marine proteins out of prairie sunlight. Nutrient-dense fish meal and feed pellets must be manufactured and hauled across thousands of kilometers of Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Rail lines before reaching feeding hoppers. Then, once harvested and chilled, finished product must immediately ride those same transcontinental transport corridors back out to reach premium dining tables and grocery chains in Montreal, Calgary, and international export hubs. Every single kilogram of seafood pulled from an inland basin carries a freight manifest cost that a net pen operator on the Pacific coast never pays. When you analyze the target species list through that economic lens, the biological roster stops looking like an arbitrary collection of exotic species. Sockeye and Atlantic salmon, rockfish, white-leg shrimp, red king crab, sea urchins, and cultured freshwater pearls. No operator in these remote interior basins is cultivating low-margin commodity fish because low-value bulk species cannot absorb fixed transport overhead. Exceptional value density per kilogram is the fundamental economic threshold required to clear the freight bill. This economic filter explains why this specific aquaculture model has not materialized across every arid basin on the continent. Replicating this system requires three complex conditions simultaneously: accessible saline surface hydrology, reliable baseload electric power to drive industrial pumps and automated heating grids continuously, and an integrated cold chain intermodal logistics corridor capable of moving fresh, chilled protein to high-value metropolitan markets within 24 hours of harvest. Canada's western transportation backbone spent decades expanding heavy rail spurs, national highway networks, and regional cold storage hubs for grain, energy, and potash. Aquaculture facilities simply hooked into that pre-existing industrial artery. The fish farming itself is impressive, but the transcontinental rail line running beneath it makes it a viable business. That economic reality is best illustrated by flagship land-based salmon operations. Regional aquaculture companies have constructed state-of-the-art, closed-loop facilities capable of managing 40 million smolts annually, scaling overall operational output toward 12,000 metric tons. These facilities introduced automated submersible maintenance robotics and pioneered some of the country's most sophisticated, semi-closed recirculating aquaculture systems, continuously purifying, reoxygenating, and cycling water rather than relying on constant extraction from local aquifers. Harvested salmon can be processed on an inland prairie flat and sit on a restaurant cutting board in downtown Vancouver or Toronto in under 24 hours. That engineering framework represents the core truth of this entire development. Once processed water is contained within a tightly regulated recirculating loop, the surrounding desert-like landscape stops being a limiting factor. The dry Badlands are not being transformed, they are being bypassed. Nor did this technical expertise appear overnight. Experimental introductions of rainbow trout into interior river drainage systems began over 50 years ago, laying biological groundwork for cold-water fish culture. The patience involved across decades of trial and error is immense. In deep, cold, endorheic lakes that historically held zero commercial finfish populations, early stocking trials of lake whitefish produced survival rates of barely 3% during initial incubation. Provincial fishery departments and private research cooperatives invested hundreds of thousands of dollars, hired specialized limnologists, and dedicated more than a decade to refining incubation biology and hatchery parameters. Over 10 painstaking years, hatching survival climbed from 3% to 36%, a 12-fold efficiency gain. That single inland water body now exports hundreds of tons of high-grade whitefish every year. Elsewhere, the commercial turnaround came much faster. Certain operations pivoted through trials of freshwater crustaceans before scaling intensive production of rainbow trout and Arctic char, generating millions of dollars in annual wholesale revenue. Across major saline lakes and containment basins, seasonal harvests have broken historical records across multiple commercial species, landing millions of freshwater prawns, specialty crabs, and tens of thousands of finfish. Then there are cultured freshwater pearl ventures, where operators have seeded millions of specialized mussels in monitored containment cells. Extreme day-to-night temperature swings and unbroken sunshine that drive finfish metabolism also trigger dense nacre deposition in bivalves, producing pearls of exceptional luster and structural density. But the real elegance lies in the closed ecological loop. Organic biowaste from fish ponds converts into nitrates and amino acids that nourish aquatic microflora, which in turn feed bivalve colonies. Shellfish actively clean the water column, cutting biofiltration and purification overhead for the entire facility. Marine protein is not the only crop emerging from these mineral basins. Specialized salt-tolerant crops, developed to thrive in high salinity and alkaline soils where standard grain and canola wither, have undergone extensive field trials across the Canadian interior. Agronomists cultivated test plots across distinct saline soil classifications, optimizing precision drip irrigation and rotating cultivars until they established viable yields. Harvest data from large-scale test acreage confirmed robust grain output, requiring fleets of standard combines to harvest. More importantly, As these specialized root systems established themselves, residual mineral salinity in surrounding topsoil decreased significantly over successive planting seasons. Vegetation was actively remediating degraded ground. Yet this biological progress arrived alongside new environmental complexities. Recent atmospheric shifts brought unseasonal summer flash floods to arid interior basins. Severe mountain meltwater surges and intense localized downpours breached earthen berms, inundated access roads, and overwhelmed regional drainage ditches. The cause was multifaceted. Sustained summer heat domes accelerated glacial melt across headwaters, while sudden atmospheric rivers dumped torrential precipitation across parched terrain. But free floodwater does not solve the long-term hydrology of an arid basin. Coarse, sandy soils lack the clay composition required to retain water, allowing runoff to drain away rapidly, while intense evaporation claims the remainder within weeks. Glacial meltwater is a non-renewable capital withdrawal from an alpine reserve that is not being replenished. When the glacial source diminishes, seasonal meltwater surges decline with it, tightening the water budget for every downstream user. This reality brings the entire narrative into sharp perspective. No one conquered the Badlands, and no one turned barren alkaline ground into natural farmland. What engineers and scientists actually built is an array of closed, automated life support systems that treat the dry interior as a neutral physical platform. They harness uninterrupted solar radiation, geographic biosecurity, and stark thermal shifts while engineering around natural water scarcity. The fish are not fighting the arid landscape. They are sharing a strictly metered watershed with conventional row crop agriculture. In an environment where every liter of water carries a direct cost, the real technological triumph is the closed, recirculating loop that keeps the entire ecosystem alive.